What's happening, guys? Supernova here, back with another video. Real quick before we get started though, just a heads up, I've had more than one person come to me and say that they found themselves unsubscribed from this channel for whatever reason. So if you are someone who has subscribed to this channel in the past, please go and double check to make sure that you're still subscribed. Because like I said, for whatever reason, people are finding that they're being unsubscribed from this channel automatically. For who the fuck knows, YouTube is stupid, but anyway. Like I said, just a heads up. Now, the reason I'm making this video is because I've seen so many people over the last months and weeks say that next generation should be defined by 4K 60. Every game should be native 4K, 60 frames per second, that there's no excuse for games not running at 60 frames per second, and that they are going to be very upset if they are not seeing games running at 60 frames per second. And I remember there were a few people that were kind of bitching and complaining when the PlayStation 5 event took place, and they found out that most of the PlayStation 5 games shown were not running at 60 frames per second, but were running at 30 frames per second. And while more than likely most of the people airing their grievances were just Xbox fanboys talking shit, I'm sure many of the people were also PlayStation fans thinking to themselves, the PlayStation 5 is supposed to be extremely powerful. Why can't it play games at 60 frames per second? And after the event took place, we actually had a former principal software engineer for PlayStation 5 actually explain to us why many of these games were running at 30 frames per second. And it had nothing to do with limitations of the hardware, and more to do with limitations of TVs and developers' decisions based on the HDR capabilities of those TVs. I'll read directly from the article what the guy was saying, but just a heads up, it is kind of techie, jarbled nonsense and maybe difficult for you to understand, so I will do my best to explain to you what it is that he's talking about. Matt Hargett points out in a tweet that the problem is not with the console, but with players' TVs. He writes that a typical cheap 4K TV can only do 420 HDR at 4K and 60 Hz, but can push the HDR to 422 at 4K and 30 Hz. Most game developers would rather have their games look good in 4K than have them run at 60 frames per second, and it seems they must sacrifice one or the other. Developers want their games looking filmic, as Hargett puts it, and wants more people to be able to experience their games in sharp detail and bright colors. Now, I'm sure you're able to understand most of that, but the parts you probably didn't understand was the 420 and the 422. Now, I'm going to link a video I found of someone explaining what these numbers mean in the description, because they're going to do a better job of explaining it than I will, but I'm still going to give you like a basic explanation. These numbers refer to what's called color sampling. There's 444, 422, and 420. 444 captures the most color information about a particular image. 422 captures half the amount of information, and 420 captures even less information. So if you're using 422, you're going to have a more detailed and colorful picture than if you're running 420. And according to him, many TVs are not able to run 422 at 60 Hz or 60 frames per second. So the developers can either have their games run at 60 frames per second and run 420, which means a less colorful, detailed game, or they can drop it down to 30 frames per second and be able to do 422 and have a much more colorful, detailed picture. The devs are opting to have the better looking game rather than the smoother running game, if that makes sense. He also mentioned the quote, filmic quality of the games and how developers wanted to maintain that filmic quality. And this is something I try to explain to people all the time. Because me personally, there are certain games that I prefer at 30 frames per second and that I believe should be at 30 frames per second. Bro, you're so full of shit, you're just damage controlling. 50 flops, yo. Now, your fighting games, racing games, and first person shooters, those should be 60 frames or up because of the types of games that they are. But games that are supposed to be cinematic, your third person action adventure games, your The Last of Us, your Uncharted, games like that, where they're supposed to have a very cinematic feel to them, those games for me look better at 30 frames per second because they have that quote unquote filmic quality. Once you increase the frames per second up to 60, they then lose that. They look a little weird. Do they run smoother? Absolutely. But they lose that cinematic movie-like feel. Same thing with like God of War, for example. God of War has the two modes you can choose from. You can choose from the graphics mode or the performance mode. The second you put it in performance mode and it kicks the game up to 60 frames per second, it's buttery smooth, but it loses that filmic quality. It loses that cinematic feel. And I'm going to attempt to demonstrate to you exactly what I mean using a clip from the Avengers. Now, something many of you probably do not know is that the movies that we watch every day are only 24 frames per second. When you buy those movie tickets to sit down and watch your summer blockbuster movies at the movie theater of your choice, that movie is only playing in 24 frames per second. Same with the clip that you're looking at right now. This clip is from the first Avengers movie, running at 24 frames per second, and nothing about it looks out of the ordinary. It looks like we're watching a movie, right? Like nothing looks strange, the motions don't look weird, the animations look fine. The CG, even though it's CG, it still feels like we're watching a movie, and it looks like it was filmed with like a movie camera, like a high quality movie camera. Okay? Now, I would love to be able to show you that same clip running right now on the screen in 60 frames per second. But unfortunately, my limited knowledge of how to use Final Cut Pro, since I'm self-taught, is making it so I can't upload clips in 60 frames per second. Even though I have the clip saved to my computer in 60 frames per second, when I import it into Final Cut Pro, it automatically drops it to 24 frames per second. So what I will do instead is I will put a link in the description to the clip on YouTube so you can click on it and see for yourself. When you watch it, you'll notice that everything is a little strange, that the animations look weird, that everything, it almost looks like it's filmed with an iPhone or a cell phone rather than filmed with a movie camera. The whole cinematic, filmic look to the movie is gone when it's at 60 frames per second. This is the same issue that I have playing video games. When I play some of these games at 60 frames per second, they lose that cinematic feel. I really fucking wish I could have demonstrated better, but fucking Final Cut Pro doesn't want to let me, and like I said, I have no idea how to make the shit work, so I'm doing the fucking best I can, guys. But like I said, go check it out, and you'll see that it definitely looks off or strange, and that movie vibe is now gone because it's at 60 frames per second. I also think a lot of gamers are being very unrealistic with their expectations going into the next generation. It seems that gamers on both sides, more so on the Xbox side because it is the more powerful machine, but gamers on both sides expect games next gen to all run at native 4K with real-time ray tracing for shadows and reflections and extremely dense, detailed environments and all the bells and whistles, and do it all at a minimum of 60 frames per second. And I think that is just unrealistic. I think they're expecting way too much of these machines. In order to do all of these things, there's gonna be sacrifices that have to be made somewhere. And those sacrifices are either gonna be made in resolution, frames per second, or the actual details inside of the game itself. Something's got to give. It's kind of like the saying that you can have a car that is fast, cheap, or reliable, but it can't be all three. Because if it's cheap and reliable, it won't be fast. If it's fast and cheap, it won't be reliable. If it's fast and reliable, it ain't going to be cheap. And so on and so on. And I think that's the same type of mentality that these gamers realistically need to use when looking at gaming in the next generation. We can have graphically intensive games that push the GPUs and use real-time ray tracing and all the bells and whistles and crazy new tech of the next generation. We can have games with high frame rates. We can have games with high resolutions. But we can't have all three at the same time. Somewhere, sacrifices are going to be made. Sometimes sacrifices are going to be resolution. Sometimes the sacrifices are going to be frame rate. And sometimes the sacrifices are going to be the things that we see on screen. And it would appear that most developers, when deciding where they're going to make sacrifices, are choosing to do it in the frames per second department, because they rather keep all of the detailed environments and the ray tracing and all the other great shit in the game, and they would also like to keep the higher resolution so they have that much more detailed, crisper looking image. The developer's main goal is to make the best looking game possible, not the smoothest running game possible, if that makes sense. Now, I'm sure there are devs who are going to prioritize smoothness over anything else, and they're going to target that 60 frames per second, and that's going to be mandatory for the game they are trying to make. And those are primarily going to be your first-person shooters, racing games, and fighting games. But I think all the other games, the third-person action adventure games, your Uncharted's, your Spider-Man's, your Horizon Zero Dawn's, your Fable, if they actually finally unveil Fable, games like that, I think that developers are going to target making the game look as good as possible, not necessarily run as smooth as possible. And let's get real for a second. Playing games at 30 frames per second doesn't feel bad. I've never once played a game running at 30 frames per second and thought to myself, fuck man, this game is clunky and slow as shit because it's 30 frames per second. Nah, the game felt fine. Do they feel smoother at 60 frames per second? Of course, but is it a huge, massive deal? Fuck no. Now, I know those of you who play a lot of online multiplayer first-person shooters are screaming at me in the comments, and listen, I get it, I understand. When it comes to playing first-person shooters online competitively, 60 frames per second should be the minimum because of how much better it is and how much better your reaction times can be and how much smoother everything runs. I totally get it. I understand. So for first-person shooters, like I said, and fighting games and racing games, I think it should be 60 frames per second. But for everything else, I have zero issue with them running at 30 frames per second. And that, like I said, to me personally, in most cases, I would prefer it. If the PlayStation 5 could run Horizon Forbidden West at 120 frames per second, I would still want the game running at 30. Because anything higher than 30 takes away that cinematic feel from the game. And I personally enjoy that cinematic feel. And that seems to be something that a lot of these developers are aiming for, is to have that, again, quote unquote, filmic feel to the games, that cinematic property. So, long story short, I don't think the 60 frames per second is the end-all, be-all when it comes to video games next generation. I don't think that 60 frames per second should define whether or not a game is a next generation game. And I also think a lot of people thinking games next gen are going to have everything turned up to the max and be native 4K while running at 60 frames per second are just being unrealistic and setting themselves up for disappointment. Hate to break it to you guys. And that's the video, guys. Let me know what you think in the comments. Do you agree with what I'm saying, or are you part of the group that's 60 frames or bust? Let me know what you think down in the comments, and as always, feel free to like, share, and subscribe, and I will catch you on the next Supernova.